Have you been the victim of a wrongdoing? A coworker makes a mistake and then blames it on you. You return home from a long day of studenting and discover that your roommate has taken your food. They deserve some sort of payback. At least that's a popular sentiment. Retributivist theories of punishment generally say that the reason to punish a wrongdoer is because they deserve it. Denying this proposition seems to suggest that it's permissible to punish people who don't deserve to be punished. And that idea sounds odd to the point of incoherence. But the standard retributivist view then needs to answer this question: what does it take to deserve punishment? We're going to begin with the notion that punishment is justified, at least sometimes. If somebody commits a robbery or a rape, abuses a child, or torches somebody's house, it's perfectly legitimate, if that person is identified, to inflict some harm on that person. The basic retributivist argument says that punishing the guilty is intrinsically good. It's a basic moral fact that the guilty deserve punishment. But this appears to be an odd claim. Different retributivist theories try different ways to flesh out and make sense of this basic intrinsic goodness of retributivist punishment. Lehora Katz begins her article on response retributivism by first looking at a couple of standard, widely accepted retributivist theories. She'll argue that they're flawed and offer a theory that avoids those problems. The first of these is benefits and burdens retributivism. Benefits and burdens retributivism argues that those who commit certain wrongdoings are acquiring an unfair benefit. They're cheating and gaining an advantage. And it's permissible to punish them in order to restore the moral balance, to place burdens on those who acquire those unfair benefits. However, benefits and burdens theories have trouble accounting for some types of wrong. The wrongness of rape, for example, seems difficult to understand in terms of the rapist acquiring an unfair advantage over others. She says, quote, "Such accounts, however, suffer from important failures, including their failure to recognize that what is fundamentally wrong with core forms of wrongdoing, e.g. murder and rape, has nothing to do with free riding or the taking of unfair advantages over others," end quote. The second form of retributivist theory that Katz discusses is what she calls alignment retributivism. This type of theory holds that it's simply an intrinsically good thing that a person's fortunes ally with what they deserve. It's a good thing that good people obtain rewards and have an overall good life, whereas malevolent and malicious people ultimately should come to suffer. Alignment retributivism is what we see explicitly in many movies and books. Before the story comes to an end, the villain experiences some sort of misfortune that's related in some important way to their wickedness. Sensing the intrinsic value of this, we wish to see it in reality just as we see it in our stories. One objection to alignment theories that Katz pointed out is attributed to H.L.A. Hart, probably the leading theorist in the philosophy of law. Hart pointed out what he called the strange alchemy of retributivism. Alignment retributivism says that it is intrinsically good that the wrongdoer suffer. If a person commits rape or murder, abuses a child, runs a business based on lies, or engages in deceptive business practices that profits the company in ways harmful to others, they should ultimately suffer for their crimes. Hart argued that it's a strange form of alchemy that mixes one part, which consists of a wrongdoing, a rape, a murder, or the exploitation of somebody, and mixes with it one part punishment, making the wrongdoer suffer, which is generally the very kind of thing that we punish people for. And we get from this mixture something that is good. It's the goodness of this mixture that's supposed to provide the defense of punishment. That which is good is something to be brought about. If this goodness isn't real, then punishment isn't justified. Another problem is that even if we accept that it is good that a good person have a good life and a malevolent person have an unhappy life, this alone doesn't justify punishment. The mere fact that something is good falls short of saying that people are justified in making others suffer just to bring about this goodness. With these problems with standard forms of retributivist theories, Katz seeks to offer another form of retributivism, which she calls response retributivism, which is supposed to avoid these problems. Response retributivism states that a failure to respond in a particular way to somebody's wrongdoing is itself a wrong. So breaking a promise is a wrongdoing, it's wrong. Rape is a wrongdoing, but a failure to respond in an appropriate way to somebody else's wrongdoing is also a wrongdoing. In Katz's words, quote, "The paper argues that the need for such negative response is grounded in the pro tanto duty we have to meaningfully disassociate from the devaluation inherent in the action of the wrongdoer." End quote. Katz puts a lot of weight on this duty to dissociate, but she doesn't offer much of an explanation. As I understand it, to dissociate is to break an association, which would appear to argue for excommunicating or banishing the offender. But Katz wants to offer this as a justification for retributivist punishment. I think we need to understand this in terms of taking sides. In a conflict between the wrongdoer and the wronged, one has a duty to side with the wronged and against the wrongdoer. This involves more than dissociation in the traditional sense. It involves taking action against the wrongdoer. Consider the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I'm going to work under the assumption that invading another country and trying to take its property is a wrongdoing. So under the assumption that Russia is a wrongdoer and Ukraine is wronged, it is not sufficient to sit on the sidelines. One must dissociate from the wrongdoing by siding with the wronged against the wrongdoer, which means taking actions that are harmful to the wrongdoer. If one discovers that a roommate invaded one's room and took something belonging to another roommate, money or something else of value, doing nothing violates the duty that one has to the roommate that was the victim to stand up against the wrongdoer. As Katz said, quote, "Where one is in an appropriate relationship with the wrongdoer, to fail to reject the devaluation inherent in the wrongdoer's culpable action, to fail to respond negatively to what the wrongdoer has done, is to commit a wrong." End quote. Katz also wrote, quote, "Much like standing by as someone drowns has moral significance and is constitutive of inadequately regarding others, absent justification or excuses. Standing by in the face of relevant wrongdoing and continuing the relationship without pause or modification constitutes a structurally similar, though lesser, failure." End quote. Katz uses as an example somebody who was robbed while they're waiting at a street corner for their spouse. The spouse shows up after the robbery, is told about the robbery, and responds with indifference, "So where do you want to go eat?" In this case, the robber committed a wrongdoing by devaluing the victim's worth as a person. This is what made the robbery wrong. The spouse, in showing indifference to the robbery, is also devaluing the victim's worth as a person. So if the theft is wrong, then the indifferent response to the theft is also wrong. As another example, those who are indifferent to the plight of the Jews in the Holocaust or the plight of blacks under Jim Crow laws are showing the same indifference to the victims as those who perpetuated these wrongs. Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, wrote, quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice." Unquote. Next, as philosophers generally do, Katz then went on to consider various objections to her thesis. For the first objection, Katz considered the objection that her thesis does not justify punishment. It calls for an appropriate response, but among the list of appropriate responses we can include things like the following: the condemnation of the wrongdoer, the defense of the victim from further transgressions, the cutting off of positive relationships with the wrongdoer, such as social ostracism. However, in order for her theory to be a retributivist theory of punishment, Katz needs to argue that doing harm to the wrongdoer is a duty. Traditional punishment involves deliberately harming the wrongdoer. In order to provide a theory of punishment, Katz has to argue that intentionally harming the wrongdoer for its own sake and not for the sake of some other end, such as self-defense, is a required response to wrongdoing. Katz's response to this objection is that these milder forms of response are simply insufficient given the significance of the wrongdoing. To respond to a rape, for example, with only verbal condemnation, defense of the victim, and shunning understates the wrongness of rape. It's to fail to take rape seriously. A punitive, deliberately harmful response would be required against this type of wrongdoing. At this point in the debate, Katz introduces an element of cultural moral relativism into her theory. What constitutes an appropriately serious response depends, in part, on one's culture. It seems possible, according to Katz, that in some cultures an expression of disapproval could be appropriate to serious wrongdoing. She said, quote, "In some societies, long-term incarceration might be required to respond appropriately to severely devaluative wrongs. In others, milder measures may be sufficient to dissociate, and in a world fundamentally different from our own, the mere expression of blame may constitute an appropriate response for even the gravest wrongs." End quote. Now, this question of whether we should accept or reject this culturally relative aspect are separate from the reasons for accepting or rejecting the overall theory. In the interest of time, I want to set this debate aside and simply note that it exists. What seems to be required is that the harm one inflicts be significant enough to take seriously the magnitude of the wrong, and this may vary from culture to culture. It's true that how harmful certain responses are may depend on cultural factors. In a status culture, a loss of status may be a significant harm. In a culture where suicide is preferable to a loss of honor may be the worst form of punishment. Okay, so let's go back to considering objections to Katz's theory. Another objection, which Katz doesn't consider, asks where this duty comes from. A deterrence theory would say that if such a duty exists, it would be because people acting in accordance with this duty will produce good consequences, such as making the offending actions less common within the community. In other words, it serves an end other than retribution. Katz has to argue that serving this duty has value for its own sake, independent of its service to some other end. Katz doesn't answer this objection, but she is aware of it. She wrote, quote, "Justifying punishment in terms of ulterior ends, these abandon the project of explicating why punishment might be valuable for its own sake." End quote. She didn't answer this question, and it's actually easy to see why. It's a huge topic, and it couldn't fit into this paper. In writing a paper like this, an author needs to reduce the scope to make it manageable. Katz limited the scope of this paper by simply assuming the principle that some act types are intrinsically right or wrong. In fact, on her account, the wrongdoings that deserve punishment are themselves intrinsically wrong. What's wrong with rape and murder isn't that they fail to produce good consequences. What's wrong with rape and murder is the way the victim is treated by the wrongdoer. And what's wrong with failure to respond with retributivist justice against the wrongdoer is what one is saying about the worth of the victim. In summary, Katz attempted to provide us with an improved version of retributivism. Unlike the benefits and burdens theories of retributivism, it doesn't say that the wrongness of rape and murder is due to taking an unfair advantage and that punishment is justified because it reduces this advantage. Instead, the wrongness of an action like rape and murder is grounded on the failure to treat somebody as they ought to be treated, treating them as something less than they deserve. And the wrongness of a failure to respond to wrongdoing with retributivist punishment also treats the victim as something less than they deserve. And unlike alignment theories, response retributivism doesn't propose some sort of retributivist alchemy where one part wrongful action plus one part punishment produces something that's good. Instead, the retributivist response is a regrettable badness, something that's bad, but which is required by a duty to respond appropriately to the wrongdoing.